Okay, so let's continue where we left off from creating our virtual machine. We'll go through each one of these in the list here. Let's start with CPU. Okay, so for our virtual hardware, for CPU, we have a couple options here. We could select the number of processors we would like in this host, um, the number of sockets we could select plus the cores per socket. Um, so we can make a selection here. You have quite a few different combinations. This will depend on your host that you're running this on, the maximum cores that it supports. So mine support 8. We'll just do 4. Okay, so 4 cores here. Here we have the feature of CPU hot plug. This is basically if we would want to add CPU later on to our virtual machine, we could just do that without powering off the VM. So whilst this is running our hot add feature, so we could do that there. Reservation limits and shares, we'll leave the configuration for this for advanced vSphere course, but just know that you could configure those for CPU and your memory and stuff in here. Okay, so this is our CPU ID mask for our VM. You could hide or show that from this option here. Okay, so you could either hide that or expose that in here. And this is relating to the movement of VM from one host to another in our cluster. We could either configure here or we could do the EVC settings on our cluster. Basically, you would want to hide this if you're moving VM from one host to another that don't have the same CPU architecture, the host. So this is where you would do that. Hardware virtualization, we could enable that in the guest OS for this, or enable hardware virtualization to provide that to our guests. So basically, if we're running nested virtualization, we could expose that here. CPU affinity, we could look at those configurations there. Coming down in the list, we have our CPU virtualization settings. Okay, so we have a couple options for this. The default is automatic. So this is really to allow us to configure if our VM would take the hardware virtualization support from the host that is running on. So we could configure that. Let me just minimize the CPU setting. Okay. For memory, we have the same configuration for shares, limit, and reservation, but so we'll just skip over that for now. This is where we'll select the amount of memory we're running on this virtual machine. We could over provision this, as I mentioned previously. Could set this to gig or meg, so let's just do 4 gigs on this VM. Coming down here, similar to CPU, you could do hot plug for your memory or hot memory, so you could configure or enable that there. So you would need to actually power off your VM to add memory. Well, this is based to if your guest OS supports that. So most of the newer operating system or most of the operating system now should support that. Okay, so let's move down in our list here. We have our new hard disk. Maximum size. So this is dependent on the underlying infrastructure, how much free space we have there. Based on that, we could build out our VM. We'll set the default leave the default at 40. That's a recommendation that we have based on the guest OS that we chose of Server 2012. Storage policy, here it is again. Location for our virtual disk, we will want to store that with the virtual machine, or we could browse to store it somewhere else. We'll leave the default. These are our 3 settings that we discussed previously. We'll go ahead and do thin provisioning for this. Okay, so we have similar settings for resource management. We have our sharing, share is our IOPS limit. We could configure those in here. Or flash read cache, we could set that here too. Okay, so we could enable that first. Okay, so coming down in our list here, we have our virtual disk type. So let me just click this at the corner. We have a little explanation here. With the dependent disk type, this is where we will want to create snapshots with. The independent one, these don't support snapshots. You have a couple different type of independent here. The persistent one. This is where the changes are written to the disk immediately, whereas in the other, the non-persistent, you could power off your virtual machine, and once it comes up back, you'll default. The settings wouldn't take there. So basically, if you're doing some sort of testing or demonstration, you could set it to the independent non-persistent mode and demonstrate something. You power off. Once you come back, those settings would go away. Okay, so that little feature would come in handy there. Okay, that should be our settings for this. We'll talk a little bit about RDM this in a little bit later. So let's move down in this list here. Our SCSI controller, currently it's using the LSI logic SAS. We could change that here. Recall the 4 different types of controllers we spoke of before. They are listed down there. So let's just minimize that back. For networking, the adapter type, we have the 4 different types we discussed in our slides. For our network type here, we could choose our network or select one or browse for more if we had multiple there. MAC address, if we want to specify a MAC address. We'll go to manual, so it would already create this is the VMware specific OUI. We'll just enter our auto part here, but for now let's just leave this to automatic. We don't have any reason really to manually set our MAC address. So let's come down in our list. We have our CD DVD drive. We have a setting here if it's connected or not connected. Let's just step back up here. We have the same for our network too, and some of these settings here, well, most of them you could actually just hit the X at the corner here, and that would actually delete the device from this VM. So back to our CD DVD drive here, we wanted this to connect at power on because we will actually be installing a guest OS on this VM. We have a couple options too. If you click the drop down list here, we have a data store ISO file. So this would be an ISO file that was already uploaded to the data store on this host. So that's one option. We have the option of connecting to the host device or the host CD-ROM drive. Okay, and then the other option we have to connect to our client CD-ROM, our client that we're using to connect the vSphere web client here. So I want to select a data store ISO file that I would have uploaded. So this would be in the local data store. There should be one here somewhere. Okay, let's just skip this over for now, and we'll get back to this after we finish creating this virtual machine. We'll try to load that ISO here. I thought I uploaded one here. Okay, so for now, let's just change this. Okay. Okay, so coming down in our list, we have our floppy drive. Basically, you could use a floppy drive image. You could mount one or create one. Don't really use floppy drive a lot now, so we might as well just delete this device here. For a video card, we have a couple settings here for monitors if you're using dual monitor. For our video memory, the amount there, we could use a calculator too to select the resolution we want to work with, and then it will make a recommendation for memory. So we have some 3D graphic settings here, and so we'll just skip over that. This is basically if you're running not a server basically, but if you're running Windows desktop or a client OS, you don't want to configure those settings. Okay, so we have our VMCI or virtual machine communication interface as we come down here. So this is basically a channel, a high-speed channel between our VM and hypervisor. I don't know of any use case for this really, so let's just skip over that. And we have some other config here, or other devices we could add. PCI controller or ID buses, controller here. So we could if there is anything else we didn't see here, we probably look in that list, any other device we'll need to add. That's basically it for now in this list here. What I want to show you guys is at the bottom here, you could add additional devices. So you could add another VMDK disk. So add another one. Okay, and once I hit add here, that will just come here. Okay, so now we have our one hard disk there, then we have another here. We have the option too of adding existing disk. So I don't know, maybe say for example your VMX file get corrupted or deleted some way or the other, you could just run through back this wizard, create back a virtual machine, and then add an existing VMDK file that you already had. Okay, RDM this is where we would add that. If we hit add here, we'll point this to a LAN that we have in our infrastructure. So we basically map in the RDM to a LAN directly there. Okay, and then you have a couple other options, so a serial port and those other stuff if you want to add a SCSI controller. Okay, we won't go through all of those in detail because we cover some of those above here. For our VM options, we have a couple things here. Let's start from the general options. We could configure a name or config file there. This is blanked out because we already selected that. Coming down, we have our VM remote console options. What we want to do and when the last user disconnects from our console, we could limit the number of connections that we have to this VM console. Okay, Then if you come under the VMware tools, we have the different options here. What does the stop button do? We could change the options there for pause. We could just come down in the list and change those. Okay. Run VMware tools script. Um, so if we had some tool that we point our VMware, some script that we point our VMware tools to run, this is where we'll configure the settings for those. Okay. Um, Before shutting down your gas or after power on, that's when you want it to run. You'll configure all of that in here. All right. So for power management, we have some basic power management settings here we could configure. So how we want our VM to respond when our guest OS is placed in standby. We could suspend the VM, or we could put the guest OS into standby mode and leave the VM on. We have a couple options there. We have our wake on LAN settings. Okay. The boot option. This one is an important setting. So if you take a look here, um, which firmware we would want to use, EFI or BIOS. By default, it's set to BIOS. Coming down here, the boot delay. Okay, so when your VM is powered on, this is your boot order screen, how long you would want that to delay. So you could actually see what's going on there. Normally when you boot your VM, it goes by so fast you can't really read the settings there. Okay. What you could do also is, rather than trying to hit, I think it's F2 to get into the BIOS on the VM, which most times you don't get to, because before you could hit the console and go in F2, it would already boot the OS. So you could come in your Force BIOS setup here and turn this on, so the next time you start this machine, it will come straight back into your BIOS, and then you could uncheck this afterwards. Okay. And if your VM failed to find a boot device, you could set a recovery here. Okay. A couple other things we have to discuss here. Login settings. This is where we'll configure our debug and statistics settings. Then we could set our swap file location. We have a couple options for that. We would have looked at the swap file configuration under the ESXi host. So once that would have been configured, we would have set up a data store for that. We could use this option here. We could leave it at the default, or use specify that we want it to be stored with the VM. Okay. If you come down in our list here, edit configuration. Recall we looked at the VMX file, and you had a bunch of configs in there. If you wanted to add a line of config in that, this is where you would edit this. Basically, VMware doesn't recommend you manually edit that VMX file. So if you need to add something to it, this is where they would want you to add those config. Okay. And then we spoke about the fiber channel and PIV previously in our slide. So let's move on from here. Next, we have our storage DRS rule. If we had those configured, we'll work on this in our advanced vSphere course. So for now, I think we have this set up like how we want. 4 gigs of memory, 2 CPUs, 40 gigs. Okay. Let me try mounting this. Let me try mounting our ISO image so we could install an guest OS at the end of this. Let me try that again. Okay, here it is. So I have my Windows Server ISO here. Okay, so we'd mount that, hit next. So it'll give us a little summary. We could review this and then hit next on this to finish the creation of this virtual machine. So let's come into our VM and template view. Here is our virtual machine that we just created. Okay, 2 CPU, 4 gigs of memory, 40 gig hard disk space. If you come into edit here, okay, we could get back to those same settings we were talking about just now. Let's just cancel out of this. So over on the left here in our VM and template view, we have our VM listed here. What we could now do, we could right click here and work with this VM. For example, let's say we no longer need this VM. We could go ahead and delete it. We could delete it from this. If we do a delete from this here, this would delete the actual virtual machine from your data store. Okay, if you do remove from inventory, it will just remove the VM from our console. So let's do that. Let's just test this out. Remove from inventory. Okay, how do we add that back now to our inventory? We would come to our data store where it's located, ESXi5, browse files there. Okay, in our VM1, so we'll just select that to list our files, and here it is, the VMX file. So what we will do is we'll just register this VM back in our inventory. So recall we we remove it from our inventory list there. So now we could just register it back to the inventory. If we did a delete, then it will take away this entire directory and file. Okay, so then we'll can recover back from that. So let me just register this VM. Select data center 1. You want it on ESXi5. Hit next. Finish. Okay. So now if we come back into the VM and templates view, we should see that VM back here in our list. Alright. So we have our ISO image here. We are ready to boot this machine up. So we could right click our VM and power on. So let's just go ahead and power this on. So let's go across and take a look at our console for this. Okay. Okay, so our installer has booted here. So what I'll do is I'll pause the recording for now. I'll go ahead and install this, and then at the end of this installation we'll continue to demonstrate the VMware tools installation. Okay. Okay, so we have our guest operating system installed here. If we come back to our console summary screen, you'll see that VMware tools is not installed. We could select here to install it. It's basically an image, so once we hit mount here, it would mount in this VM. So let's go back to this now. Okay, we should be able to see this mounted. If you notice, the mouse is behaving a bit weird here. So we just need to get this mounted as soon as possible, so we'll have our tools installed. Okay, so here it is mounted. We could just run the installer. So once this is finished, we should have better performance with our mouse and switching between the console and the outside of this. So let's just give this a couple seconds. Okay, so our installer is preparing here. It's quite easy how fast you could have a VM up and running. You just went through the wizard, create a virtual machine, add our ISO to it, and just boot that up. What I'll talk about in a little bit is our content libraries. So we could create a repository for our templates or ISO images and share those, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this course. So I'll just select complete and then do an installation here really fast. All right, so this will take a couple seconds more to install, and once this is completed, we'll continue from there. Okay, so once this was completed and I restarted, our VMware tools is now installed. If we see at the bottom here, next to the clock, it's showing that our VMware tool service is running.